we need to debunk the myths. Not everyone who talks about themselves for 5 minutes is a narcissist. And not everyone who is doing harm or is abusive is a narcissist. So there's a lot of mythology out there about what is narcissism, how does it evolve, what does it look like, and what are narcissistic individuals capable of. It's not a one size fits all. It does happen along a spectrum. So there's a lot to be said, on a topic that's become incredibly commercially popular.
Hope you enjoy a preview of this full episode published exclusively as a bonus for our incredible online neuro-nerd community. This group is the backbone that keeps this podcast thriving, and you can find out more at therapistuncensored.com/join.
Hey everyone, our guest today is Wendy Behary, and she is an expert on narcissism, has been writing on it for so many years. She has a 3rd edition book, Disarming the Narcissist, Surviving and Thriving with a Self-Absorbed. She is also the founder and director of the Cognitive Therapy Center in New Jersey and the Schema Therapy Institutes of New Jersey, New York, and DC. So a long list of insights, a long history. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Anne. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I was thinking about this being your 3rd edition, and your 1st edition came out in 2008. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So 2 thoughts. First of all, what made you decide to specialize in narcissism as a question? And then I'm also dying for us to unpack kind of how you see it, like the evolution of our understanding of narcissism from 2008 to 2025. How did you dive into narcissism as an expertise?
Is Wendy Behary a masochist? What was she thinking?
That's what people say. That's what people say about me about being a couples therapist. Like, what are you thinking?
I know, and I do that too. So I'm a double jeopardy masochist, and I work with couples with issues of narcissism. So the joke I like to tell is I chose a specialty in narcissism because they never call you. Well, the truth is they don't call you. I mean, they don't typically want to come to therapy. And when they do finally come to therapy, they begin to bond. You feel that kind of new fortification of trust and connection in treatment. That's when the leverage sort of shifts over to you and the relationship in therapy. And there's something really rewarding about being able to make a difference with someone who is so challenging and so difficult. And it doesn't happen all the time. It doesn't happen often enough, unfortunately. And we can get into talking why. But I got into it because I was basically 30 years ago in, kind of the early days of my career, I was curious, and I was really curious about why I was getting so triggered with certain types of clients in treatment, like really triggered. I would just sort of drop into this old pattern of giving in, subjugating myself, apologizing, sacrificing, ignoring, avoiding, not confronting, not setting limits, not holding accountable. I was, quaking in my boots. And I got curious about that. One cannot be effective if you are highly activated. I was at the time working with Dr. Jeffrey Young, the founder of Schema Therapy, which is the model that I practice. We were very early in the development of the model, and I sort of got the role. I was kind of cast in the role of, okay, you work on that, let's work on that. Let's figure out how we can modify our approach to work with narcissistic individuals. And it's been exciting and rewarding and hard and challenging to work with this population. I wrote my book in 2008, the 1st edition, when there were a tiny handful of books written on this topic. And by the time I wrote the 2nd edition, there were probably a couple thousand books. And now who knows? I mean, by the time I wrote the 3rd edition, just countless numbers of books on the topic. And to just touch on the question you asked, which is really important, and something I've been speaking a lot about, is we need to debunk the myths. Not everyone who talks about themselves for 5 minutes is a narcissist. And not everyone who is doing harm or is abusive is a narcissist. So there's a lot of mythology out there about what is narcissism, how does it evolve, what does it look like, and what are narcissistic individuals capable of? It's not a one size fits all. It does happen along a spectrum. So there's a lot to be said, on a topic that's become incredibly commercially popular.
Wow, it really has. And I guess for all sorts of good reasons, which we can drop into later. But let's start with a debunking. Like how do you distinguish between somebody that, like you said, somebody can be abusive in a relationship but not be a narcissist? So there's all sorts of differences. Can you help us like unpack what you see does qualify as a narcissist versus somebody who's struggling with being able to have deep connection?
Sure. Yeah. And again, if we think about it as happening along a spectrum, then there's the opportunity to see levels of intensity, levels of severity when it comes to narcissistic traits, if you will. But the one common denominator that you'll find in narcissism that you won't find in other personality types is this really high sense of entitlement. High entitlement, low empathy, and sometimes you can throw in things like, coerciveness, exploitation. Certainly, they're all highly self absorbed. There's a great energy and attention focused on how am I doing? How am I showing up? What's my performance looking like? Are you envious of me yet? It's a lot of how do I look to the world outside? It's a lot of not really listening to what's coming in, not being receptive to others except where it serves them. And there's a whole reason for that, that's built into the background, their own upbringing and experiences and unmet needs, et cetera. But the one common denominator that you'll find always is this level of entitlement. And that's what makes it so difficult in treatment. Whereas if you're working with someone, for example, who has a high sexual preoccupation or sex addiction, if you will, they may feel great shame when that becomes exposed. They may feel great remorse when they see the hurt that it's caused and the impact it's had on their family, their partners. Narcissists tend to be more focused on justifying their behavior, feeling entitled to it. So there's a lot of work to be done with, dismissal and devaluation and denial and minimization, which is all part of them feeling entitled to do as I please, to make the rules, to break the rules, to write the laws, to have special privileges.
And it's so easy to, in a mythical way, like all of a sudden classify everyone that's having difficulty in communication and disconnection as being narcissistic. And somebody could easily monopolize the conversation due to lack of skill, due to difficulties with connection to self. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're entitled to do it and that they don't feel like a sense of embarrassment if the awareness is brought to them that they keep cutting you off, et cetera. So that's what you're saying then is one of the distinction is the sense of I'm going to defend myself that this I'm entitled to do this, and we're going to divert that as this is something you're causing me to do.
Exactly. You've provoked it, you've caused it. But the truth is, and the weird irony, just to make this even more complicated, because it is a complex personality type, is we know there's shame. We know there's an understanding that I've done something wrong, I've crossed a line. They're typically not stupid as a person. So what is that then? Where does that entitlement come from? And I think it's just an automated knee-jerk response when they feel even a little twinge of that shame coming up. Like, oops. And then it's, well, can you blame me? I mean, if you just paid more attention, if you just showed more appreciation, if you just this or that, if you'd stop doing this or that. So there's, I worked hard for this. What's the big deal? Aren't I entitled to have some fun? Aren't I entitled to make mistakes? And I can't even qualify this as a mistake. So they're dancing around it because there's something at the core that they're not even aware of that is burning a little bit. We think of that as kind of that level of toxic shame that often lives in the core of narcissism.
How does somebody develop that ability to have, or I guess a disability to have that sense of entitlement?
In the types of people that we're likely as therapists to see in the treatment room, narcissists that come to therapy, they're coming in often because they've been given an ultimatum. There's a consequence they don't want to face. We call that leverage, some high stakes consequence that they don't want to face. And so they come to therapy. What we discover, and the research is only just beginning to really expand on the topic of narcissism. It's been a tough population to really study thoroughly But what we see, or I'll speak for myself, what I've seen over the years is someone who I imagine, because we don't know for sure, may come to the world with a kind of sensitivity or maybe even a hypersensitivity in their temperament. Now, there is some research being done on this, elements and levels of sensitivity in narcissists that maybe is part of a biological marker of some sort. Maybe a higher degree of impulsivity, maybe a lower tolerance for frustration. I don't know, maybe. But then we also have to consider the environment that they meet when they come into the world. And if that environment cannot adequately meet those needs for unconditional love, for attention, for limit setting, for frustration tolerance, for helping them to begin to develop maybe a thicker skin around things that they may misinterpret, it's typically the opposite. And so what happens is they become, in many cases, overachievers, overperformers, why you'll find them often in leadership roles and celebrity positions and politics and all kinds of higher places. But you can find narcissists in all walks of life. So let's not create another myth about that. And I think that entitlement is what becomes a compensation for a very high degree of insecurity at the core. This insecurity that's based in a lack of unconditional love and unconditional acceptance. In other words, just being able to be cherished for my little self without having to do anything, without having to prove myself, without having to be extraordinary, without having to win the awards, without having to be the surrogate for my mom who's depressed, or, the trophy child for my dad who's living through me vicariously. There's a lot of stories and profiles that we see, but a lot of it lands on this high degree of performance, especially in grandiose types, if we're talking about classic grandiose narcissism. But underneath, a lot of insecurity, a lot of shame, a lot of, forbidden failure. And so the entitlement serves as a compensation. Like, they rise to fame, they make money, they do well. And even if they're not at the top of the top in their class and rank, they will be wherever they sit, in their socioeconomic strata. They'll still have some extraordinary and unique feature. Even covert narcissists, for example, who are more vulnerable types, will be the most extraordinary victims you've ever met in treatment. They're what I call in my book the super sufferers. They're the ones who, nobody appreciates how hard it is for me. So there's something extraordinary that gives them permission, there's the entitlement, to behave in the ways they do and to have what they want when they want it, without effect, without consequence.
We often refer to it as like the age of narcissism. Does that feel accurate to you? Does it feel different the way that narcissism is received? And, I guess the level of confidence and the level of entitlement. Do you see a difference in how that's manifesting now than when you wrote the first book in 2008?
I think it's an age of awareness of narcissism. And I think the awareness of it, is coming largely from, some people who have been profiled in this way and become more of a public topic around the kitchen table. And I think also because we have social media now, there's social media. So you can put yourself out there in whatever, glamorous, award-winning way that you want to. I mean, you can basically present to the world whatever it is that you want. You want to just flex your muscles every day on Instagram, you can do that, So there's this kind of red carpet for just showing yourself. And with that combined with a higher degree of awareness of narcissism, it's become a really hot topic. It's given, there's a lot more people you would interview on your podcast, and I imagine, who are experts in narcissistic abuse. They're talking to the people who have been abused, mistreated by narcissists. I work with those folks too, by the way, who are sitting on the other side. But there's not that many who are working with the narcissist themselves. And here's the other myth. Narcissists cannot be treated. It's hopeless. Run for your life. They are the devil incarnate. They are hopeless. They are demons, right? It's hopeless. Narcissists can never be empathic. They are incapable of empathy. So there's the other myths that are really popularized on the internet. And for a lot of people who've been wounded by them, there's some comfort in believing that that's true. there's some comfort in thinking that there was never any hope. There's no hope for empathy. And in some cases, in many cases, they may be right simply because that person that they were connected with there would never be enough leverage to get them into therapy. And even if they did, chances of meeting a therapist who would understand and be able to hold their feet to the ground and have a model that's going to be effective enough at diving into the deep, dark waters, it's really few and far between.
Thanks for listening to this preview of bonus content. If you would like to continue with the episode or to support free worldwide access to important material like this, you can join our online community for as little as $5 a month at therapistuncensored.com/join. Thanks.